Welcome to ARE Live. I'm Marc Teer, the founder of Black Spectacles. Today I'm sitting across from Mike Newman, who's going to field your awesome questions, of which you guys sent a ton at lightning speed, because we only have an hour here. So this is going to be a really great Q&A session with Mike. And what's cool is that there's a lot of different questions covering a wide range of exams and NCARB topics. So this is going to be a really good session. But before we get started, if you'd like to attend our next ARE Live broadcast, where we'll review our PPP mock exam, Programming, Planning, and Practice mock exam, on May 25th, visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register. And during the broadcast, just like today, you'll have a chance to ask questions to the group and Mike. Excuse me. Now, if you don't know Mike, he's an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also the founder of Shed Studio, and he's the instructor for Black Spectacles online AIA ARE prep curriculum. If you haven't already checked out our AIA ARE prep curriculum, head over to blackspectacles.com to check out any of the free tutorials from the courses. And at the end today, we have a special Black Spectacles promo code to share, so make sure you stay tuned for that at the end. And then also, tonight we'll be taking questions and any of your comments using both the GoToWebinar question box as well as on Twitter using the ARE Live podcast hashtag. So hashtag ARE Live podcast if you're on Twitter. But first, let's go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Newman.
Okay. Hey, everybody. So as Marc said, we got lots and lots of very good questions, most of which I think will present us with lots to talk about. There are bound to be a few of these questions that the answers that we give are going to be very unsatisfactory because there's just sort of the nature of some of these things are just complicated. But we'll talk about it to the best extent that we can. And sort of run through it. As Marc said, some of these are more about kind of NCARB and about the process, and a few of them are much more specific, actual sort of detailed questions. And so we'll just kind of run through and get through as many as we sort of think we can raise through. So I'm just going to dive right in. Jennifer asked, in some of the videos that we've put out on the Black Spectacles site, that there was sort of a question about kind of how cooling works. And her specific question was that we went over the concept of cooling, about how you take the refrigerant and you compress it and then you let it expand in another portion of the same loop, and that by compressing and letting it expand and compressing and letting it expand, that sort of cycle that gets created, which is shown here in this little diagram, this very drawn over diagram, that allows you to alter the temperature because there's a direct relationship between the pressure of the refrigerant and the temperature of that same refrigerant. And this is the tool, this is the basic tool for how you do air conditioning. You know, when you're doing heating, you just burn something and it gets hot and then you take that heat and you move it around. But when you're cooling, it's really tricky because you can't just make something cool. You actually have to remove the heat, which sounds simple, but when you start sort of playing it out, it becomes a little complicated. And so the way that got figured out way back in the early days of the 20th century, there were some even earlier examples where people kind of came up with similar ideas, but really became sort of commercially viable in the early days of the 20th century, was this idea of this relationship between pressure and temperature for refrigerants. And so by compressing, hence you hear the term a compressor for an HVAC system, by compressing the refrigerant, you make it very hot. It is therefore hotter than the outside temperature. And so it will then give off heat to the outside. And then after it's done that for a while, you bring it in and you let it go through an expansion valve and it expands and it gets much less pressure and it therefore becomes much cooler, and it is now cooler than the inside temperature, so it takes on heat from the inside. And you just keep going in this cycle, taking on heat from the inside, taking it to the outside, and giving it off. Same thing if it's a window air conditioner versus a chiller system with a whole big cooling tower and the whole thing, it's all essentially the same. That basic system is always going to be at the root of 95% of the air conditioning systems that are out there. There's a few other evaporative cooling systems and some other stuff that show up here and there, but the vast majority is going to use this refrigerant loop. So the basic question was, okay, we talked about it being 120 degrees on the one side, and then what is the temperature of the refrigerant when it's after it's gone through the expansion valve on the other side. And the example that I was using, it was actually talking about it being in the sort of 70 degree range, though I wouldn't focus on the exact numbers. In certain situations, the refrigerant is sort of required to be hotter in the compressor side and cooler on the evaporative side than other situations. And so there's a whole range of different possibilities. It will always be within a certain range, so you won't see on the hot side it being kind of different from, say, 110 to 130, I don't think it gets any higher than 130. And on the coolant side, it won't be any lower than about 50 and would go up to maybe 70, 75, something along those lines. So there's a range of use. Different refrigerants. R22 is a little different from the current one, which I always forget is R410A, I think, is the current most used refrigerant. And so some are built off of different refrigerants, and so they have to use what made sense for those refrigerants. So I wouldn't focus on the exact degrees, just that basic idea that it has to be hotter than the outside for it to be able to give off heat to the outside, and then when it's on the inside, it has to be cooler than the inside so that it can take on heat from the inside, and that's how you're sort of able to pull that heat from the inside and give it to the outside, whether it's a window air conditioner or some big complicated multi-part system with a cooling tower on the roof. The basic gist of it is always the same. So definitely spend some time making sure you feel comfortable with that idea. And while I appreciate the wanting to be specific about the exact temperature, the exact degrees, I actually wouldn't worry about it. Like I say, there's sort of a simple range, and I would just keep it there, because otherwise you're likely to make a mistake thinking that you're being more exact when in fact it's an unnecessary exactness. So good question. I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay, this is sort of a general overarching question. When will Black Spectrals have new tutorials for the ARE 5.0? And then kind of related question, can you discuss the difficulty between ARE 4.0, ARE 5.0, and the differences between the vignettes and some of the new graphic systems that they're going to be talking about in 5.0? So I'm going to bring Marc in for this because we've recently been through a number of discussions, both between us but also with NCARB. And we have a longer webinar tutorial thing that focuses on this, so you should definitely check that out. But sort of for the short version, let's bring in Marc to talk about when the tutorials will be available for ARE 5.0. Marc, do you have any wise words you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, so we're going to focus on the two exams that are part of the kind of the overlap transition. The 5 test strategy. So those are going to very likely be available sooner than the other courses for ARE 5. So you'll see those two those two courses for those two exams that are involved in the 5 test transition strategy. Those will be available in sometime between August and September. And you guys should just know that in addition to building a full curriculum for ARE 5, a video tutorial based one, we'll also be developing additional tools to really round out the entire offering. So there's lots of stuff that's going on. Needless to say, we're quite busy because there's lots of great stuff that we're.
It's very exciting, though. I think it's a great opportunity. We're very happy and excited that the switchover is happening because it gives us this opportunity to kind of focus on it, and so that's great. So, kind of regarding the specific question about 4.0 versus 5.0. So, one is not necessarily better than the other. It really depends on who you are and where you are in the process. There are differences, though. So like I said, there are other places where we go more in depth, but we'll just do a sort of short description here. Right now, under 4.0, as everybody knows, the sort of gist of the situation is I have a whole series of individual exams about individual topics. Now, because it's architecture, any one individual topic actually has a tendency to sort of slip and slide over from one topic to another. For example, if you're talking about soil, are you really talking about construction systems, or are you talking about site planning? So even though it's in these individual silos, it still has a lot of slippage between one exam and another. But the gist of it is I have an exam for structures, I have an exam for systems, I have an exam for contracts, I have an exam for site planning. And that has the benefits for the person taking the exam that, okay, I can just sit down for 3 weeks and just totally focus on structures or totally focus on systems. And focus on that, take the exam, hope for the best, and then move on to the next thing. So there's certain big advantages to that. 5.0 is organized totally differently. So 5.0, instead of being organized in those silos, is actually essentially organized much more like a typical architectural project. So it has two sort of outlier exams, one that is sort of about how you run a practice, and the other which is sort of more of a kind of general, how you run a project. So I have practice management and project management as these sort of two sort of outliers. But then there's 4 in a row that really are actually kind of logically thought of as in a row. And the first one is at the very beginning of a project. So you've just been awarded the project, and now you're looking at the site, you're looking at the surveys, you're looking at like, well, what are the basic cost assumptions for this? So how are we going to sort of think about that? But along with that, you would also be thinking about, all right, so for this kind of project and this kind of location, I wonder what kind of structural system we would use. Is this going to be a concrete system? Is it going to be a long span system? Is it going to be a steel system? So it'd be basic kind of structural, basic questions about how you would approach a project. Similarly with systems, you'd be thinking about, all right, we're right at the beginning of the project, what are our first assumptions given the program, given the location, given the sort of marketing that's local to that place, all of those kinds of questions. So it's in the beginning of a project, but it touches on contracts, it touches on systems, touches on structures, all of those things. Okay, now we get to the next one of the 4. That's going to be kind of that design development kind of realm. You're really you kind of in the schematic design development, you're really starting to get into the detail. So now you're going to have all those same basic questions about structures, about systems, about how it fits to the site plan. But now we're into the detail. Now we're starting to talk about, well, how big a parking lot is that? And how many cars can I fit in that parking lot? Maybe we chose long span. All right, did we choose long span steel truss, or did we choose long span concrete precast or something? So you're into more of the kind of specifics of the situation for that second one of those 4 exams. And then the third one is, all right, now you're effectively making the bid set, the permit set. And so now we're talking about actual details, how many bolts, maybe it's a structures question where you have to figure out how many bolts are needed, or is this steel beam wide flange going to meet the needs of the situation? You're getting into the really specific, can you now build it details. Well, same is going to be true with the contracts, same with the systems, same with the... So clearly what you're really talking about here is those 3 exams going across from the beginning to the middle to the end of the architectural process are talking about everything. They're just focused on the sort of timeline of the project. The 4th one of those is, all right, now we're in the actual construction, and so it's the construction administration end of things. So there's going to be contracts questions for that. There's going to be structural questions for that. There's going to be systems questions for that will be appropriate to that moment in the time of a project. So, all right, 4.0 silos, 5.0 is more about the sort of stream of how a normal architectural project goes forward. Therefore, if you're somebody that really feels like I need to focus on, like I need to just read structures for a couple of weeks, I just don't get it, I really need to spend time doing that, well then 4.0 is going to make more sense for you. Because you're going to have that ability to really focus in. Same with systems, same with all those contracts, all of those same questions hold. If you're somebody who maybe has a little more experience and you feel comfortable with the sort of fluidity of talking about like a basic idea of structures, moving into it as a more detailed version, and then getting into the actual calculations and details. And same with systems, and same with contracts, understanding the sort of a general way that you would approach contracts in the beginning, and then there's sort of meaningful differences that how you would talk about it as you move through the project. If that sort of fluidity feels comfortable to you, well then 5.0 is absolutely sort of the right choice. I actually think it's a very positive move on NCARB's part. I think that the switch to 5.0 makes a lot of sense. It's always felt a little false, the way that the exams lined up with the way that the sort of world works in architecture. And I think the 5.0 is a noble attempt to make that happen. I'm just not totally convinced that it actually is going to make your life easier when you're studying for it. So I think you need to sort of figure it out for yourself. How do I feel about this? Where do I fit into all of this? What makes sense for the way that I studied, what makes sense for my background and how it fits. And over the next month or two, there'll be lots more information. One of the things that's probably important to say is that the 5.0 will be starting to come online at the end of this year. I believe they still haven't given us an exact date, but presumably if you think of it as kind of Thanksgiving-ish, maybe a little after that. And then there'll be at least 18 months of overlap where both 4.0 and 5.0 are offered. So if you're in 4.0 now, you have plenty of time to finish it out in 4.0. If you decide you want to wait till 5.0, it'll start soon. One quick thing to say, which shows up in one of these questions somewhere, but maybe we'll just talk about it now, is there's this idea that you can do 3 of the exams in 4.0 and then do 2 of the exams in 5.0 that will actually cover effectively all of the topics. So you go from 4.0, which is 7 exams, to 5.0, which is 6 exams, but you can actually do it in 5 exams by following that. There's other places where we have it all written out. You can follow that, take a look for it. The one thing I would say for those folks who are interested in that idea is I think it's very clever. I think it's very smart that NCARB offers that. I think it's the right move and it's very clever. However, those 2 exams are going to be monster exams. And if you are used to the 4.0 kind of system, it'll be a bit of a surprise when you come across those, because those will be those 2 main ones of the kind of design development into CDs, and there's just a lot of information, system structures, contracts, all those things, and you're going to have to be studying for all of that in order to take those 2 exams.
And actually, let me add that, so those are the 2 exams that I was referring to, so we're going to lead and publish those courses in August, September. But to tack onto what Mike was saying, the exam is changing pretty dramatically. Like some of the question types are the same, so some of them are multiple choice questions, but they're actually introducing 2 or 3 new question types to replace the vignettes.
Right, so the vignettes are gone, the full vignettes are going to be completely gone, but then there are these new systems.
And that's why I think, to Mike's point, studying for ARE 5 is going to be, you're going to have to spend a lot of time kind of understanding those new question types and how to answer them. It is kind of a different ball game. So
yeah, and if you've started taking 4.0 and you feel very comfortable with the vignettes and you're doing well with them, I would say finish it off in 4.0. Like, it's sort of the devil you know. If you've been having trouble with the vignettes, because maybe I know some people have had difficulty, they just can't kind of vibe into it, or they have physical difficulties kind of maneuvering this very awkward software. If you're having trouble with the vignettes, well, maybe you wait till 5. But in general, my suggestion is just do it in 4.0, get it done. So much more to say about that. We've got other places where we say various things along those lines, but we're happy to answer more questions at the end as well if you have any more. All right, I'm going to move on. Here's a very specific one. All right, so I'm just going to read it out. During the structural systems course in the wind calculations example video, the importance factor, which was assigned in the example that we were using, was assigned a 1.15 value, but then it didn't show up in the final calculation. And since I just saw this a few minutes before we walked in, I actually haven't had time to go through and do the recalculation. But it's quite possible that I just made a mistake and didn't include it in the number. So let me just say generally, the importance factor, shows up in a couple different places. It shows up in wind, it shows up in earthquake discussions, it shows up in, and even some other structures questions, there'll be the idea of the importance factor. And there's never any time when you don't count it. So if I didn't count it, my apologies, it would absolutely be in there. Now, it's not going to make a massive difference because the way that importance is assigned generally is, let's say you have an agricultural building that really just has like storage of some backhoes and combines or something like that in it, and really doesn't have very many people in it. That is not going to be assigned a high importance value. So the idea there is we're not going to force people to build incredibly robust buildings that really just aren't as important, and there's not that much danger of people getting hurt if something weird like a tornado or something happened. So those have a very, very low importance factor, but the lowest it will ever go is about 0.6 or 0.75, kind of in that range. And the highest it's going to go is going to be kind of 1.15, 1.3, that kind of thing. So it ranges right around 1. And it's just sort of a way of kind of, after you go through the calculation of saying, okay, we went through the calculation, but this is a hospital, we got to be really careful. Or this is a school, we want to make sure this thing lasts because people are going to use it as a community space, especially when there's a big problem, plus we don't want the kids to get hurt. So it's just a way of tweaking the numbers to give more robustness and importance to the buildings, police stations, hospitals, schools, things like that. And if it's more of a kind of regular situation, house, something along those lines, well, it's just 1, we just leave the numbers as is. And if it's a building that really doesn't matter that much in terms of worrying about people getting hurt, well, then the number gets a little bit below 1, and it just sort of reduces the effect of the calculation a little. So absolutely it's included. It's not massively important in the sense that it's going to dramatically change the numbers, but it is important on the exam because it's an easy one to ask you about. So you really want to feel comfortable with that idea that different buildings have different levels of importance. And therefore, even though we go through a whole lot of calculations, it's essentially a factor of safety that's added onto those particular building types that are super important in an emergency situation. Okay, hopefully that was clear. Next one. All right, so here's one. Why do fire sprinklers have different color systems for the bulb than the color code? So I'm not 100% sure what that part of the question means, but I just want to focus on the idea of the color system for the bulb. That's the actual little part of the sprinkler head that gives off where it breaks open and the water actually comes out. So the thing to say here is there are a lot of different types of sprinklers. So there are sprinklers that for example, in a server space in a computer room, I wouldn't want to have a water-based sprinkler system. Obviously, it would trash all the servers, and the whole point of that room is to protect the servers. There's probably only 1 or 2 people in there. So you would use a system that would be some sort of chemical-based system that the whole point is actually to take away the oxygen, right? So that's a different kind of sprinkler system. Most places, the individual heads are going to go off when there's a problem. But in certain places, you might find that whenever there's a problem anywhere, all the heads go off. So that would be in a place like, the usual classic examples are like a hangar that has expensive airplanes in it. They just don't want to take the chance that one fire would get out of control. There's a lot of fuel around, things like that. So all the heads would go off all at once. Those are deluge systems, right? So there's lots of different kinds of systems of sprinklers. But even within each of those systems, there are different temperature ratings. So you can imagine that if you were in, let's say, an office building, and in that office building there was a big mechanical room, or like the elevator mechanical room, something like that, elevator machine room, where in that one spot, they are sometimes, for various reasons, you get a sort of spike of heat, but it's not really a spike of heat that is meaningful. It's not actually saying there's really a problem. Then you wouldn't want to use a sprinkler head that went off at the same heat level as you would in the ones that are in kind of a general office space. In a general office space, if I get a spike of heat of 180 degrees or something like that, well, that's really hot, and that means something weird is happening and you want something to respond. Whereas if I'm in the elevator machine room, actually I'm making this up, I'm not sure about elevator machine rooms, but something, a place like that generates a lot of heat, and it has systems for dissipating it, but you could easily have something, or the end of an event and suddenly the elevators are all getting used constantly and it generates some unexpected level of heat, but it dissipates out and it's actually okay, right? So there are different kinds and they're color-coded for the level of heat they can tolerate before they would go off. I wouldn't worry about it beyond that. I don't think you need to memorize the specific colors. I mean, feel free if you want to. I certainly haven't and won't. There's no huge advantage. That's a level of detail that's just going to start to drive you crazy. If they ask you that very specific question, and I know it's easy for me to say it, I say guess and move on. I say guess red, maybe. I think red's always a good one to guess in that situation. Because it's just not worth memorizing that kind of stuff. But it's sort of interesting to know that that exists, that there are different types, but then there's also different temperature ranges within each type. And that makes sense. You wouldn't want to have a commercial kitchen have the system go off at the same temperature as you would in a bedroom or in an office space or something, right? Because the commercial kitchen, you could easily imagine spikes of heat that would be inappropriate in those other spaces. Okay, so real quick on some of these other things. It's also one of the, just kind of, while it's worth noting here, most of the time when you are walking through a building and you see all the exposed mechanicals, you can always tell the basic sprinkler pipes because they're unpainted. So there tend to be black pipe. Different locations possibly might have slightly different rules about that, but generally all the ones I've seen, it's always that they don't want you to paint the pipes and that they use black pipes. And that's so that the fire marshals, when they're walking through the building, they can very easily and quickly see everything. They can test it easily. They don't get lost. Like, they have a lot of stuff to cover. So they just want to make sure it's all there. So that's why generally you'll see that. You can actually get them to approve you painting it if you really need it for some reason. But for the most part, they really don't want you to do that. And mostly they don't want you to do that because they don't want you spray painting near the heads, and it gets clogged up. It starts causing troubles. You can make it so that the sprinklers don't actually work anymore, but also so that they can track it as they're moving through a building that's under construction and make sure that you're not doing something that's going to cause trouble. They can actually see it very easily. Okay, so real quick on some of these other ones. So sprinklers, like I said, there's lots of different types. When you use the word valve in this context, there's lots and lots and lots of different ways that that word gets used. So I'm just going to kind of skip by that one and say that that's just any time there's something that can alter the flow of the water. And so it's a place you can turn it off, it's a place you can open it up, it's a place that you can connect to a fire hydrant or a pumper truck. Anytime I have that ability to move something, change the flow, that's a valve. So dedicated standpipe valve, and then the next one is combination standpipe and sprinkler valve. So the word there to know is standpipe. Standpipe is that vertical pipe Generally, it's located by the stairs. And the reason it's located by the stairs is because it needs to go all the way from the first floor all the way up the building. So if you have a 5 or 6 story building, the one place that you know will be continuously running all the way up is going to be the stair. And so you generally have it the standpipe goes right up by that. And the standpipe is a way, if you imagine firefighters running into a building in an emergency, and if they tie their fire hose to a hydrant out on the street, and then they're carrying a full fire hose up the stairs, you can imagine how messy, how water gets everywhere, people are slipping and sliding. There's going to be more people in the hospital from slipping on all the water than from the smoke or from the fire. So them running up, it's very difficult to do. It's really complicated. They're running by people who are trying to exit in a panic. And so much, much easier is you attach to what's usually referred to as a Siamese connection on the street. That's how it'll be referred to, and that's usually because it comes out of the front of the building and then splits into 2. I'm sure that's a racist, ridiculous thing to say, so they're probably trying to get rid of that. But when you hear the standpipe valve, that's what you're talking about. That's where the firefighters can show up, attach a hose to a hydrant or to their pumper truck, and then attach the other end to the standpipe, and then that pipe can fill with water running all the way right up next to the stairs. The firefighters can run up with an empty hose just over their shoulders. They run up to the floor where the fire is. They can attach to the standpipe at that floor and then fight the fire. So the standpipe becomes kind of part of that fire hose, if you will, and allows them to not have the fire hose tripping people in the stairwell. So it's by the stairs as a way to get it up vertically, because you know the stairs are going to be going all the way vertically, but it's also by the stairs so that when the firefighters jump out of the stairs, bang, there's the standpipe right there. They don't have to find it somewhere in the floor plan. So standpipes, they will be referred to in lots of different ways, but that idea that you can attach at the street front and then it takes water vertically all the way through. So then the tricky one is the combination. Sometimes standpipes also work with the sprinkler systems, and so that's when you have this sort of combination sprinkler standpipe situation. And so you will occasionally see very complicated standpipe valves out on the street front where it'll have a bunch of different, it'll say this one's associated just for the standpipe, this one's a sprinkler standpipe, this one's a, and it might have 5 or 6 or 7 different ones, especially for complicated buildings like a school building or something like that. You could easily have multiples for different types of uses through the building. So back to the sort of colors, I wouldn't spend time memorizing them, just know that there are these differences. You also may be interested, since this came up, you may be interested in the fact that hydrants are different colors. And those are different colors not from a temperature standpoint, but in terms of gallons per minute that they can produce. So if you see different fire hydrant colors around the city, that's just referring to how much water they have the capacity to pump out. That way when firefighters show up, they can make a quick decision about how much water is literally going to be able to be brought to bear and whether they need to attach to multiple hydrants or something along those lines. Again, I wouldn't worry about the specific colors, just know that that exists. Okay, so here's a process question. So below is a question dealing with the rolling clock and how it may affect having to retake the ARE for initial registration based on a hypothetical scenario. Let's assume candidate is able to pass all of the 7 under 4.0, 7 ARE exams within a year of passing the first one, and then for some reason reasons that are beyond this person's control, it takes them 8 years to complete IDP. So it takes them 8 years to get all the sort of paperwork end of things kind of completed. And by the time that they get all that done and they're ready to do the initial registration, they realize that eight years have elapsed, and at that moment, would they need to retake the ARE? So there's a couple of things to say about this. First of all, neither Marc nor I are experts on IDP, ARE, per each individual state, all of that kind of stuff. There's a lot of variation. You actually become licensed by the state, and so clearly that's more than 50, because there's also territories. That's more than 50 different, subtly different versions of how these things go. So you absolutely want to find out about it for your particular state before I would trust anything that I would say. The gist of what I'm going to tell you, though, here is the rolling clock is one issue, and then the timeline from when you finish your exams to when you finish, when you have everything else finished and actually get the initial registration, those are two separate numbers. You can actually get them to extend your rolling clock if you've finished everything, but you have to ask for it, and they have the ability to say no if they don't think your reasons are good enough. But if you have reasonable reasons, they will extend it. Same with the length of time from when you finish the exam to when you actually become licensed. Some places, I think it's as short as a year. Other places, I believe it's maybe 2 years. There might be a 3-year area. So it's actually kind of a big deal. You should absolutely know your local version of that. But it is actually two separate questions. There are a couple of other rolling clocks in there as well. So I would definitely kind of talk to your local folks. The best way to do it, the people who you really need to talk to are your local state licensing board. So if you're in Colorado, it's probably the Colorado Professional Regulation Board or something like that.
And guys, we have I'll share a link to this. We have a blog post that links to all of the state licensing boards, if I'm not mistaken. I'll share that with you. So whatever state you're in, you can click on that and you can find the right person to talk to. I'll share it in the GoToWebinar panel here.
And that is actually the actual place you should go. It's probably easier, frankly, to go just talk to your local AIA chapter. There's probably somebody there who is an expert on what happens in that local area. They're dying to help young architects get licensed. They will absolutely be very helpful in that process. Also, most universities have somebody who's sort of their IDP sort of go-to person. You can track those people down. So there's a lot of people out there who can help you answer the question. It's just that it's so similar across the board, but then there are these subtle differences, which is why we're being a little cagey about answering it, because we don't want to tell you one thing and have it be wrong. So talk to the folks at your local AIA, and then talk to the local state licensing board for professional architects. Often they're grouped together, so it'll say something like professional regulation. Sometimes it's just architects. All right, hopefully that was helpful. All right, we got a couple different questions here. I'll probably pick and choose a few. What kind of lights should be used on public streets? So let's talk about that one for a second. That's kind of an interesting one. If you were asking me this question even a year ago, I would say absolutely HIDs, high intensity discharge lights. So metal halides, sodium discharge lights. There's a whole series of HID lights, high intensity discharge lights, that are super efficient. Don't necessarily have the best color rendering, but like really who cares? It's a public street. They're very efficient and long lasting, and just completely make sense for that kind of use, that kind of low level use where you need to get a lot of light because it's probably pretty high up in the air, and it's going to cover a pretty big area. And the high intensity discharges, they operate kind of similar to how a fluorescent operates. They're actually in the same family of lighting fixtures, but they're sort of a little different, a little more specific. Their big downsides is they don't turn on fast, but that doesn't matter for a public street. You don't need it to like come on in half a second. If it takes 4 or 5 minutes for it to turn on, that's fine. So high intensity discharge is the likely answer. In actuality, in the last year, 2 years, 6 months, I've actually seen quite a lot of articles about how cities are moving over to these brand new LEDs. It took a long time for the LEDs to sort of find their markets in ways that could fit to the needs that people were having. And the thing that the municipalities love about the LEDs for public streets is that the advantage, people always think that the LEDs are much more energy efficient than like HIDs, and for the most part they're not really. From what I've seen, the LEDs are pretty close, but actually not as efficient. But the big advantage that they have, they probably will become more efficient as they get better, but the big advantage they have right now is they last longer. And if you're a municipality and you can have a situation where instead of having to change the street lights every 3 years or every 5 years or something, if you can do it every 7 years, that's a big cost difference from just the man hours. So I honestly don't know whether the exam is caught up to the LEDs on that kind of thing. So I would think of those two. I think if they offer LEDs, that's probably the answer. If LEDs isn't offered, then HIDs would be the logical answer. All right, let's see. Yeah. So what are the properties of non-cohesive soils? Actually, I'm going to jump to the previous one. What happens in phase 1 versus phase 2? I'm assuming this is an environmental phase 1 that the question is about, an environmental phase 2. So if you're somebody who has just bought a piece of land or is in the process of buying a piece of land, and you're talking to the seller, and the seller has to tell you some piece of information because that's the law, you can't hide things, and the seller tells you, oh, by the way, there used to be a manufacturing thing on this site that made adhesives. And you'd be like, wow, adhesives, that sounds toxic. I'll bet there's a lot of problems on the site. Do you have a phase 1? And what the phase 1 would tell somebody, and if they didn't, you might get it, but somebody would have to get the phase 1 in that situation. The environmental phase 1 is going to be a situation where sort of knowledgeable entity, there's companies that do this work, specifically environmental engineers, would go out and do not testing, but they would do kind of a walkthrough, take a look at what they saw. They would do an analysis of the historical records of the site. And so they would kind of do a paperwork and kind of quick walkthrough version of an environmental analysis. If when they're walking through they see things that they absolutely know, like the classic one is the 9x9 floor tiles, which usually have asbestos in them, or they see pipe wrap that has asbestos, or they see what there's kind of the remnants of old tanks of what might be toxic chemicals around the site, something like that. If they see it, if they physically see it, well then that goes into phase 1, and that either tells people that they should do or not do whatever they're going to do next, but it would effectively kick in the need to have a phase 2. If they do the walkthrough, they don't see anything, but then they do the paperwork stuff and they look around, they find all the historical data, and they realize, oh wait, this is definitely a place that is a likely place where there's a problem, then that would kick in the phase 2. But if they do the walkthrough and they do the sort of quick analysis of all of the historical data, and they don't see anything that seems like a smoking gun, then there's really no need to do the phase 2, and you sort of hope for the best, and it's sort of a way that people can not get sucked into huge costs in environmental analysis, and still kind of keep a project rolling along. But if anything tips it off and it says, no, this looks really kind of dangerous, we haven't done the test yet, but this seems like there's a problem, then you do the phase 2. The phase 2 is much more expensive and much more specific, and they'll go through and test everything, send it to testing agencies, and maybe you have to do digging on the site to find tanks in the ground or whatever it happens to be. They'll look for everything and test everything, test the soils, test the paint, test the pipe wrap, all of that stuff. So it's a much more involved, much longer process. But then what comes out of it is the environmental report, and that phase 2 environmental report will have all sorts of information, not only about what was found, but also about the best way to tackle it. So if encapsulation makes sense, it'll say we recommend encapsulation for these areas and not for these areas. If removal makes sense, then they'll talk about that. It's sort of a big sort of what's there, what's the problem, and how to deal with it process. Whereas the phase 1, fairly simple, keep it nice and easy. People can figure out whether they really need to go to the phase 2 or not, but it kind of gets you to that spot where you can make a reasonable decision. All right, I'm going to keep moving on. We'll come back to those if we have a little time at the end. All right, Michael asks, what is your advice and/or do you have a state of mind rules of thumb? I like that, Michael. For how we should be thinking when taking the PPP and CDS exam. I'm having difficulty answering multiple choice situational questions because I'm projecting what I would do or have already done in real practice versus what the AIA wants me to do to pass the exam. Distinguishing the two is my biggest challenge. I know that I know the content, but I can't really interpret the questions and answers correctly. I'm always able to narrow down to a couple of choices, but they seem equally acceptable with the in terms of the question. So it always brings me to a kind of, well, it depends. Is there a way to clarify the question? If I had a way to hit a clarify the question button on the exam, I would hit it. I love that idea. We should suggest that to NCARB. Am I overthinking this? So my first response is, if you say to yourself, I wonder if I'm overthinking this, I can almost guarantee you you're overthinking it. So the short answer to your question is, we all work in a real world, but the exam can't really be about the real world because the real world is so real and so different in so many different places. And it's not really the point, right? The point of the exam is to say, this is how contractually things make sense, right? So I'll give you a quick example. In the contracts, it's very clear that the architect's role, if you look at the B101 compared to the A101, which is the contractor's contract, the architect's role is for the design intent. The contractor's role, among a few others, is for the means and methods. It's for actually making that design manifest. So there's all sorts of things that means. One of them is, if there's a safety issue on the site, it is not the architect's role to comment about it or to do anything about it. The site, means and methods, that includes how they do it, whether it's safe or not, all of that stuff falls under the contractor's needs, duties. So if you walk onto a job site and there's a big ditch on one side and there's no railing to stop, a temporary railing to stop people from falling into the ditch while they're moving I don't know, lumber around or something, and you stand there and you say, wow, this is really dangerous, you should put a railing here. Technically, you just usurped the liability for all the safety issues on the site because you became an expert and said, I am now taking over liability of the safety issues on the site by telling you, put a railing here. Which, in that one example, is probably not a big deal, but then 3 months later, when something else happens, and the contractor tells their insurance company, well, that guy did say something about the railing a while back, suddenly that insurance company says, oh great, that means we don't have to pay this, that means their insurance company has to pay this. And it can become a really big problem. So there are very clear rules. If you see a question that says, you see a safety problem on the site, should I call the owner, B, should I do? The answer is always going to be the least thing because it's not your role to do it. Okay, real world? Really, I'm going to stand there and let somebody fall down into a shaft or into a big ditch and hurt themselves? No, of course I'm going to mention something to somebody. But I'm going to know, because I've read the contracts and I've been through this before and I've talked to people about it, that that's an issue. And so I'm going to be very careful about how I talk about it, right? The real world situation, like, I'm not going to let somebody get hurt, right? That doesn't make any sense. But it also doesn't make sense to just ignore the realities of the contracts. So that's a long way of getting to, yeah, there is the real world. That is not what the question is about. The question is about how does NCARB and the AIA, and frankly, the lawyers for the AIA, think you should answer the question. So I always suggest people, when they read the questions, you should never think, just as a mindset issue, you should never think, gee, I wonder what the right answer is. You should always be thinking, I wonder what the answer they want is. It's just a different way of approaching it, and it's hugely impactful if you think of it in that way. Another sort of quick example along those lines, some of you have probably heard me say this before. I think this is long enough ago that I'm past the statute of limitations. I can actually use this example. Back when I took the exam in the mid-90s, I think 20 years gets us past anything. One of the questions came, it was about a historical question, and it asked about who developed the first grid plans for cityscapes. Like who came up with grid layout for cities. And the various answers, there was a couple different, there was like medieval England, there was the Greeks, there was somebody else, and there was some Chinese thing. And the answer they were looking for was clearly the Greeks, right? It's definitely not medieval England. It definitely wasn't whatever the other one was. But I happened, in my undergrad, worked for one of my professors who had done this sort of architectural project very specifically about this one very interesting ancient Chinese city that was essentially a grid layout way before the Greeks. And so I was sitting there thinking, I got this one. I know the answer to this one. And then I fortunately stopped and said to myself, wait a minute, I have to be the only person in this room, and this is back when we all did it together, this room is filled with like 400 people, that would know that answer. That can't possibly be the answer they're looking for. They clearly want the standard, yeah, it was the Greeks, right? That's how you have to think about it. Not what is the right answer, but what is the answer they want me to answer. So I hope that helps. Don't overthink it. The worst thing you can get is starting to get into that cycle of having, worrying about each answer and like going back over it and back over it. Having that albatross on you will absolutely make you make mistakes because you'll start overthinking, you'll be reading too much into it. You just want to take your best guess, first draft, what do I think they want me to answer that one, move on. It's totally plausible you could have just gotten a bunch of questions that you just didn't know the answer to. There's a lot of questions out there. The next round you get, quite likely you'll get a bunch of questions that you actually do know the answer to. Don't overthink it. Don't make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. All right. That probably didn't help at all. All right, here we go. Why doesn't NCARB provide a breakdown of a passing grade in an exam? I suspect that to pass an ARE, you don't need level 1 performance in each category, depending on how you perform on the other categories. Is it possible that you score a level 2 in one category and level 1s in all the others? What do you think? So there is actually quite a bit to say about this. I'm only going to touch on it briefly because it starts getting into a lot of sort of statistical numbers and things. The gist of the situation is the current version right now is you have 3 categories, one of which is passing, 2 of which are not passing. One of the not passing is very close to the edge, and the other one is you really didn't pass. The issue there is, let's say there's 4 categories, and let's say of the 4 categories, you got 3 1s. So 3 passing, but then you got 1 that was either a 2 or a 3, so didn't pass. And then you didn't pass the overall exam. You're like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. I got 3 1s, and then on this 1 out of the 4, I got a non-passing. Like that doesn't make any sense. I should have passed that. Well, maybe, but maybe not, because it kind of depends. You know, the passing doesn't say you passed by a lot. It just says you passed. If you passed just barely on all 3 of those, and the one that you got the non-passing on was maybe it was divided into these 4 categories, but maybe that one category was actually 50% of the questions. Like there's different categories, and some are larger and some are smaller. So you may have not passed on the biggest category. So it's actually, they've kind of decided this isn't terribly useful for people, but it is the way that they're doing it now. So 4.0 is going to stay like this. But under 5.0, they're actually going to change it. So in 5.0, there'll be 2 passing categories. There'll be 1, 2, where 1 is totally passed, 2 is passed but close to the edge, and then there'll be 2 failing categories, 3 and 4. So 3 close to the edge, but failing, and then 4 completely blew that one. So presumably that one extra category will make it easier to sort of understand, really where you fit into that as a process. Okay, now I'm going to say the heretical thing. I know this is super important to people. I know it's crazy when you think you should have passed something and you didn't. I actually wouldn't really focus too much on those things. I think there's so many reasons why you can pass or not pass an exam that I would just choose to think of taking the exam as a learning experience. Take what you can get out of, like, how did it feel to answer the questions, what felt like you were doing it right, what felt like was a problem, and then just take it again. I know it costs money, but it's really not a big deal. Other than the money, it's really not a big deal to take it again. No future employer is going to know you took something 3 times, something like that. It doesn't matter. It's a good way to get to know the exam just by taking it. And people are always asking me, well, how many do I need to pass in order to pass? And the answer is pass as many of them as you can. I know it's easy for me to say and harder to hear. I just don't think it's a useful way of spending your time kind of going through it. In specific situations, I see why you might want to know, like, all right, I seem to get passing grades in all of these issues, but then there's this one area that I always have a problem in. I should spend more time on that. That's what those numbers are useful for. I wouldn't worry about it in terms of anything other than that. Okay, Tina and Kyle have a couple questions here, similar. What advice do you have for someone that just isn't getting the NCARB way of asking questions? Am I reading too much into these questions or not enough? And Kyle, what is the best way to study for CD&S, especially in the 2 areas of construction drawings and project manual and project practice and management? So Tina, I'm going to essentially say exactly what we just said to the last last question. If the issue is whether you're overthinking it, you probably are. I would really just try to focus on kind of narrowing down what the question is really about. And also, think about how fast these questions need to be gone through. Like if you have 90 questions in 100 minutes or 90 questions in 80 minutes or something, that's right about 1 minute per question. So you really need to be answering these things in about 45 seconds, something like that. Each exam is a little different, so look at it for yourself about finding those numbers. But that's pretty fast. And if you find yourself working on a question in that kind of scenario and it's taking you a minute and a half, 2 minutes, guess and move on. It's not, any one question is not important enough to throw your game off for the rest of the questions. So again, don't overread into it, don't over worry about it. Just take the questions as best you can. Eventually you'll get the right bunch of questions and you'll be able to answer them. Okay, Kyle's thing about construction drawing and project manual and the project and practice management. This one, absolutely the go-to spot to study for this is the book that the AIA puts out, which is called the Handbook for Professional Practice. There are about 15 different versions of it. There's a student version, there's like a big version, there's like a slim kind of summary version, there's a whole bunch of different versions. Really, any of them will be fine. The one thing I would say is they redo the contracts every 10 years on the 7. So the last time was in 2007. The next time will be in 2017. And so if you're using one from 2004 or 2002 or something, take some of the specifics a little bit with a grain of salt. They're likely to be slightly different, not much different, but slightly different than a more current one. But I guarantee either the office you work in has a copy of this, or you can go borrow it from the local AIA office, or somebody you know, a friend has a copy because the office that they work in has it. You can find a copy of this book, absolutely, Handbook of Professional Practice. Almost all of the questions are straight out of there for those portions of the exam. It doesn't mean it'll be a straight, read page 15 and that's the answer to question number 6. You have to kind of think it through, but the gist of the information is all in there. It's also a great book to have. I think the student version is like maybe $60 or $70, and the more professional versions are probably in the kind of $120, $140 range, something like that. I haven't bought one for a little while, but it's something along those lines. So absolutely get your hands on those. Newer the better. If you are just starting the process, I'm sure the new ones for 2017 will be even better because they'll include the newest version of the contracts. Okay, Sandra asked, how effective is a green roof in terms of leaking and humidity coming into the building in states like Florida where we have heavy rain? And also pricing and some of the other options. So green roofs are really kind of intriguing. The reason that people like green roofs, there are direct advantages to a building owner, especially in a hot climate. The evaporative aspect of how a green roof can absorb water and then let that water evaporate away can be very meaningful in terms of sort of general cooling. It doesn't always work that way. If the humidity is so high that it actually never evaporates, then it's not helping. But it has the ability to sort of act in cooling. In colder climates, the green roof creates a sort of distance. It's not really insulation. People often talk about it as insulation, but wet dirt is not going to give you a very high R value, so it's not insulation in the same way that we think of as other forms of insulation. But it creates a barrier, a distance for the wind, cold wind blowing across a roof, which can pull the heat out of a building. And so it affects buildings pretty dramatically. But frankly, that's not really why there's a big push for green roofs. The big push for green roofs is actually not so much helping the individual building owner, it's helping the municipality. Because what we've done is we've made buildings and parking lots all over our suburbs and cities that effectively capture water and then send it somewhere. And so we're capturing huge, huge, huge quantities of water, putting it into pipes, sending it long distances to then be filtered. And every time we put a new parking lot, every time we put a new roof, we're putting more water into those systems, and we're just completely overcharging the systems that we have. We have so much built area. And so the idea of the permeable pavers for parking lots allows water to just come down, hit the parking lot, and instead of being collected, to just filter itself right through the soil, stay on the site, and therefore not increase the overall needs for the municipality, which is meaningful because when you do that, that's also where a lot of the floods are coming from. People's basements getting flooded out because their systems are combined systems, and you get a big rain and all that water has to go somewhere, and it pushes through and it pushes the sewage into people's houses, and those people vote, and so they get mad and things go haywire. So there's lots of effort to stop the sort of over supercharging of our systems. So permeable pavers would be the one on the ground. Green roofs are the ones for the rooftops. The big advantage of them is that they can absorb massive amounts of heavy rain, and then over time slowly give that water off in like 3 different ways. One way is that it will eventually start to evaporate into the air, so it goes back up into the clouds. Another way is it gets used by the plants, and then as the plants use it, it becomes evaporative again in some other way. And then the third way is it just sort of absorbs like a giant sponge, a huge amount of water, and then some of it will get used and evaporative, and some will sort of eventually drip down to the bottom and find its way out and go to a gutter and that sort of system. But it'll be a much, much, much smaller percentage, and it will be delayed. So that the big problem is when you have a big storm, and that huge rush of water, Well, this is effectively taking away a big chunk of that water, but also delaying the rest of it so that it actually gets to the system, to this drainage system, well after the storm has gone by and after there's a big problem. So weirdly, the green roofs, not that meaningful to building owners, but are very meaningful to code officials and the people who run the municipalities in terms of making everything kind of work effectively. That's why they started showing up a few years ago in the codes and in the zoning codes, and that they would give a lot of overlay stuff where if you put a green roof in, you get, maybe you can have an extra residential unit, or you can build a little bit bigger of a building, that kind of thing. That they're trying to make green roofs economically viable for people because it is so advantageous to the towns. The specific meaningfulness in a place like Florida, because of the humidity levels, the thing to say about green roofs, like any roof, if you build a roof well, it shouldn't leak. The biggest problem with green roofs, this has actually happened to me, is that we had a roof, we just put in a green roof and then it started to leak, and the clients went kind of ballistic, and I went and talked to the folks who put the roof in, and I said, hey, your roof is leaking. And the guy said, no, it isn't. I guarantee it's not leaking. And we went and we took off all of the green roof, and we sprayed the roof with water for, I forget what it was, 8 hours or something like that, and no water came through. And we finally realized there was a little tiny plastic line going to the ice maker in the refrigerator that, because of the way it was set up, it had to go up into the ceiling and over and down, and somebody had nicked it with a screw or nail or something, and that's where the water was coming from. And you have never seen a roofer more happy than that moment when we found out that thing. So that's the big problem with green roofs, is that it's a hassle. If something goes wrong, you got to move all that stuff around, but they actually are protective of the roof. You're less likely to have a leak if the green roof is there. You don't have the sun beating down on it, the UV rays, you don't have ice and other things kind of affecting the roof. So it actually is better for the roof and less likely to leak, but if it does leak, it's a bigger problem. So there you go.
We'll do one more?
All right, one more. We'll pick and choose a couple out of this one. How about? All right. One quick one. How about what is an ALTA survey? So ALTA surveys, when the word survey is kind of fascinating because it has a lot of different meanings. Clearly we're talking about, when we say survey in this context, we're talking about when a surveyor gives and a building owner the legal description of the land. And so that can mean a lot of different things, and it depends completely on how much you're paying for, effectively. You could have a building owner say that, we don't really care about anything other than the boundary survey. We just need to know where the property lines are. Maybe they just down the road want to be able to figure out where the parking lots can go or something like that, and they don't need to have anything else. Well, that's fine. So that's a survey. A boundary survey is a survey. You might have a boundary survey that includes one of my favorite terms, the improvements, which would be anything that ever got built on that site. So you have a main building, maybe some accessory buildings, sidewalks, parking lots. Those are all considered improvements. I always like that because I've seen an awful lot of buildings that sure seem more like scars than improvements to me. But the technical term we use is those are improvements. So you might get a more detailed survey that includes all the buildings. Okay, well, we also might get a survey that includes where the gas lines are in the street. We might get a survey that includes the topography, because that topography does not come automatically in a survey. You have to actually ask for it, and it costs more because it's a lot more time consuming. I might get a survey that has the topography, the gas lines, and locates all the trees, or maybe all the trees with a caliper bigger than 6 or something. So there's all sorts of different levels of surveys that you can get. So the ALTA survey, all that is I forget exactly what ALTA stands for, but it's the American Land Title Association or something like that. So that's a group of lawyers effectively who are talking about title of land, and they realized, well, in a lot of different contracts here and there, somebody says, all right, you have to have a survey. Well, maybe the seller doesn't want to spend the money on a complicated one, and so they just do a boundary survey, but that doesn't show anything useful to the other people, and so, but it was contractually meeting the thing in need of a survey. So they came up with this idea of the ALTA survey, and there's nothing particularly meaningful about it. It's just, it's a survey type that has a series of specific issues that you know will always be covered. So it'll have the boundary shown, it'll have any of the improvements shown, it'll typically show where the main gas and water and all of that is. And there's a few other sort of items like that. But it's just sort of a grouping of issues that way the lawyers know that all of the stuff that will be needed is part of it. It doesn't necessarily include everything. The ALTA survey wouldn't include the location of the trees or the topography or these other things. It just is sort of this basic, but it's kind of all the things you would normally need for a commercial project. Most of the time for residential, I wouldn't actually bother with an ALTA survey. I'd do a simpler, cheaper version. But for commercial, almost all of the commercial real estate people will require an ALTA survey. So it's nothing particularly meaningful. It's just a grouping of issues, so that way all the lawyers feel that they've got everything covered. All right, let's see. Talked about HID bulbs a little bit. Handicap ramps, sun chart. Let's just do very quickly on the sun chart. I think there's other places where we can get more deeply into it. But the gist of talking about a sun chart, if I have that's supposed to be cardinal points north, so north is up there and south is down here. And the sun is sort of going up and over. If you think about it, right at the sort of equinox, at the kind of height of spring and fall, it's effectively going to be coming, rising in the east. The sun will be rising in the east and kind of going right up and over towards the west. In the winter, it's going to rise from below that east-west line, and it's going to come up more like that. It's hard to draw in 3 dimensions, so I'm not giving it all that great of a justice here, but in the summer, it's going to start higher than the east-west line, and it's going to go even higher up in the sky and then down. So from the point of where that building is, the charts are going to tell you that at different times of the year, the sun angle is going to be different. There's 2 different aspects to where that sun is placed in the sky. So one of them is, let's say, I'm going to do this spot right here. I think it might be easier to read. So let's say that spot right there. So one question is, how high off of the horizon is that? So here's our land, there's our building, there's the sun, right? And there's an angle right there. And that's called the solar altitude. But the other thing you need to know in order to place this sun in the 3-dimensional grid of the sky, it's a big sky, so it's hard to talk about without this, is where is it in terms of the cardinal points? So at any given moment, so this would be in the late afternoon, if we kind of took a straight line down and then drew, when it hit the horizon, drew a line back towards the point that we're kind of doing this from, that would be the azimuth. And the azimuth is the angle off of the cardinal point. Now, weirdly, the angle off of the cardinal point can be off of any cardinal point. So you can actually have an azimuth off the west or off of the north or off of the east. But almost always, for architects, we talk about it, at least in North America, we talk about it as the cardinal point off of south, because that's where it's useful. And so with those 2 numbers, you can say, all right, it's the winter, it's late afternoon. This is going to be a fairly low angle because the winter sun is low. And so I'm going to have a not very high solar angle. And it's late in the afternoon, and we know that the sun sets in the late afternoon, so it's going to be fairly far towards the west. And so those 2 numbers, we could place that sun very, very quickly and easily. Equally, if we were talking about the sun rising on hot summer day, it's actually going to be rising north of east, and then it'll be going way up high. So we're going to have a very different azimuth, and we'd have a very different solar angle. The solar angle might be close to 90, if not 90. And so it's way straight up in the air. And then the off of south, the azimuth would be more than 90 because it's actually north of that main east line. So when you're using those charts, those two numbers are telling you where that sun is. And it sounds super complicated, but it's actually not. Once you sort of get a handle on it, it's actually pretty straightforward. I have always used the Ching books because they have a couple of very simple diagrams that are totally readable and understandable. Another book that I always use for this kind of thing is Sun, Wind, and Light. I always have to look to Marc because I can never remember the exact name of it. It's a great book, very, very simple diagrams, kind of pen drawings, and gets a lot of this information across very, very simply and clearly. So I would definitely recommend checking those things out to get more information on those. From these, you can actually now, because once you sort of understand that, you can very easily look up in graphic standards and lots of other places. Here's a time of day, here's a latitude, what would be the solar angle and the azimuth, in this location. And so those charts will actually tell you all of that information, but you can also just kind of figure it out. You can get pretty close just by kind of imagining it in your head. It's different in the winter than it is in the summer. It's different in the morning than it is in the afternoon, right? It's all pretty straightforward. You know how the sun works. Now it's just putting it into numbers.
All right, the next one, just to see.
Okay, we're going to take a quick look at this. All right, this is a question about the current 4.0 vignettes, and this is kind of an interesting one. This one comes up a lot, and so there's a couple things to say about this. So real quick, NCARB response on having trouble getting the lines to land where she wanted them to land on the PPP vignette. Quote, everything snaps to an invisible grid. Behind the scenes, you would appreciate why this is so. This was the response from NCARB. And then the sort of response to that is like, well, what does that mean? It's like, how do I get it to go where I want it to go? So there's a couple things to say about this. One of them is that there is a little bit of slippage that's allowed in the vignette. So if you are trying really hard to get one thing to line up with another thing, and you just can't get it to happen, even if you zoom in and you just can't, for whatever, it's snapping to the wrong thing or something, you just can't get it to line up. Presumably that means that you're actually closer in than is necessary, and it's not expecting you to be that exact. Of course, it could also be that your computer is messed up, right, at the testing center, or some other thing, right? But the way that they would answer it is there's a little bit of slippage, and they are not expecting you to be exact right on the money all the time. It's an awkward program. They know that. They've set it up in that way. Not that it makes it harder, but they've set it up where there's a range of acceptable sort of reasonableness. Obviously, if you're in one of the vignettes where things are tighter and closer in, and smaller in scale, like the stair vignette or something like that, that the snapping range is going to be closer, tighter. Whereas if you're in the site planning, you have a little bit more room in terms of the sort of how many inches you can be off. So in general, if you're really battling the program, my suggestion is just don't battle it. Get as close as you can and move on. Because that probably is beyond what they are expecting. And it's actually kind of an interesting moment to talk about some of the stuff that's coming. This is also going to be true with the new drawing versions that are going to be coming in place of the vignettes. The vignettes are going to be totally gone. In their place will be things like okay, here's a wall section, and over to the right is
Flashing.
some flashing, and you have to put the flashing into the wall section. So you're going to physically move the flashing into the wall section, right? And you're going to get it pretty close, but obviously everybody's going to put it in slightly different locations, and it should understand that. It should understand that there's a little bit of wiggle room. They actually, NCARB actually used the word wiggle room when they were talking to us about it. Now, each different situation will be slightly different amounts of wiggle, and of course, for reasons that you can imagine, they won't tell us what the wiggle amount is. The idea is that the point is they're not trying to trip you up with the program. They're trying to see if you understand the answer. Now, that's easy to say. It doesn't mean it always feels that way when you're in the middle of it. And we get that, but the best we can say about it is if you're fighting that hard to get it exactly right, you're probably tighter in than you need to be.
And there's actually a point to probably make there, which is, I mean, after talking to the folks at NCARB, like, they get this, and they're trying to be reasonable about this. So you're not going to fail an exam because, you know, you're off by 1/4 of an inch or something, or you're off by a little bit. Like, they're looking for like a really obvious
or in like
failure.
a site plan, you're off by 6 inches or something like that.
I mean,
you know, that's a small number compared to a site plan.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, as you say, it's probably not a massive concern. And something you should spend a lot of time focusing on, I suppose.
And we totally get that that's really easy for us to say because, you know, there you are like, well, when is it a massive concern? Because they give you, you know, well, you know, you didn't pass this, you know, so it's hard to know exactly, but the general rule is if you've zoomed in and you think you know where you're meant to put it and you get reasonably close, that's probably close enough.
All right, well, maybe we'll close it up there. And we'll go ahead and thank everybody for tuning in. This was a really great collection of questions that you guys sent. So
really good questions, really interesting across the board questions.
And I know we weren't able to answer everyone's question here, of course, in about 1 hour and 20 minutes. But again, I really appreciate everybody sharing them. And I also want to thank Mike for taking some time to tackle these questions. If you guys want to attend our next ARE live broadcast, which is going to be focused on the programming, planning, and practice exam, we're going to put together a small mock exam and share it with you guys. You can visit blackspectacles.com/podcast to register to attend. And just like today's episode, you'll have a chance to ask questions and share your answers during the session for live feedback. In fact, we'll ask all of you to share your solutions to that mock exam, and then we'll discuss them during the session. And then also to learn more about our AIA ARE Prep curriculum, you can go to blackspectacles.com where you can check out any of the free videos. And for those of you who are ready to start preparing for the ARE, and if you're already an AIA member, you can use coupon code 42716QN, and that's N as in Nancy, ATW, to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your AIA ARE Prep membership. And finally, please leave a comment below the video to let us know what you think. Share any suggestions you may have. I promise we'll read every word that you write and use them to tune our next episodes. So thanks for watching.